Welcome everyone to this presentation on how you solve a case and impress your interviewer. This is consultingapplications.com, where we focus on the essentials that you need to get a job in management consulting. A case interview is a key aspect of the application process, so it's very important that you master this skill. And to do that, you essentially need two things. First, you need knowledge, and then you need to practice. At the end of this presentation, we hope to give you enough knowledge of some very important topics, and then some guidance on how you can practice in the most efficient manner. So we will cover three topics here. First, we'll talk about structuring a case and how you solve a case. So in other words, from a very technical point of view, how do you solve a case? And then we'll move into the do's and don'ts. Here we'll focus a bit more on the softer part of solving a case. Things like communication and how you come across to the interviewer. And then finally we'll talk about practicing. So we'll start with the first part, how you solve a case and how you structure. Let's look at a case interview, and what you notice is that there are typically 5 steps or 5 phases, and these are the clarification questions, the initial structure, calculations or analysis, idea generation, and finally synthesis. If you look a bit closer, you'll notice that there are actually 3 key skills that are being tested here. So you see, the first is structuring skills. When you're first given a case to solve, the very first thing you need to do is to break it down into smaller questions, into bite-sized components. And then once you have done that, you need the second skill, which is detailed thinking. Here is where you dig down into each of these sub-questions and analyze them. This involves things like logical thinking, calculations, and just being very detail oriented. And then once you've done this, you need to link all these different parts with high level thinking, which is the third skill. And here you're trying to create or piece together the final answer to that initial question. So today we'll discuss primarily the first part of this, the structuring skills. And then we will offer you some tips on how to perform better at detailed thinking and high-level thinking. So why is structure so important? It helps with 3 things. First, clear thinking. It basically helps you get your head around very complex questions, very ambiguous questions, and generally questions which have many issues which are interlinked. And these are typical questions that consultants solve. Imagine if you can take these very complex questions and break it down into, say, 5 sub-questions which are more clearly defined. It will help you think in much more concrete terms. The second thing is, it's easier to follow. If you have broken your question down into, say, 5 sub-questions, and you then need to explain your thinking and your logic to someone else, say your colleague or the client, it's much easier to walk them through step by step, instead of having that large question to discuss. And then finally, it helps you focus on the core. And what we mean by this is, it helps you focus on what you're really trying to get out of all your analysis. It is very easy to get lost in detail during your analysis, and having a clear structure really helps you go really deep in your analysis and yet always see how that links to your main question. So let's illustrate this with an example. So imagine if you're trying to decide whether or not to buy a new factory. So it is one of those questions which have many different issues which are interlinked. But let's say you break it down into 3 things. You want to know the potential revenue gains, the operational costs, and the funding structure. Doing this will really help you in approaching the problem in a very controlled way. And then it also helps you communicate with your colleagues. So imagine if you are trying to discuss with your colleague some findings that you have made, and you say, okay, right now let's talk about the first part of it, which is revenue gains. And we can see that how buying this new factory helps with increasing our output, as well as with the better equipment, we will increase quality. And by doing this, we will have more customers as well as more satisfied customers. And you can see how this is much easier than having to talk about why you should buy the factory and trying to talk about several different things at once. And then finally, the third thing, it helps you during your analysis. If you are digging into the details on how, say, equipment can help with product quality, it's very easy to start wondering, okay, how does this link to that initial question of whether or not we should buy a new factory? But having a clear structure helps you see that link very clearly, anytime. So you can see how structure is actually very critical in solving any cases in consulting. And if you think about how do you actually structure, it's important to know that consultants solve problems in two different ways. And these are the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. Basically, if we think about our initial example on whether or not to buy a new factory, the top-down approach basically involves saying, okay, let's form a hypothesis right now that it is a good idea to buy this new factory. So your hypothesis is that, yes, we should do it. But then you can't just end there. You need to then find evidence to prove that this is correct. So what do you do after you find evidence and do your analysis? Say if you build a market model and found that actually the market is not growing quickly enough to justify this. You then need to revise your hypothesis. You might say, okay, maybe we shouldn't buy the factory yet. We should buy it maybe in the future. And then you need to prove this new hypothesis. And then let's say you find that, hey, actually, the market will grow within 2 years. So we should build our factory in 1.5 years. So you see how this can arrive at an answer very quickly. But then there's a risk. Some people would try to force an evidence, or rather they will try to force the evidence to support their initial hypothesis. And this can be very dangerous. Say they insist that they should buy the factory and they want the evidence to show that the market's growing very quickly. But let's say the analysis suggests otherwise. What do? I mean, we said that they should revise their hypothesis, right? As obvious as this sounds, it's sometimes quite difficult. Imagine if management had promised shareholders that they will aggressively expand and increase the number of factories that they have. It is quite tempting to try to force that analysis to prove this right. And it's difficult to then turn around to say, hey, actually, we shouldn't grow so quickly. We should actually downsize. I mean, that's a difficult thing to say. So you can see how this approach can be quite vulnerable to biases. And then there's the second approach, the bottom-up approach. This is essentially the opposite. What you do is gather as much data as you can in anything which you think could be relevant. So this could be things like company finances, the markets, customers, macroeconomic environment. and say technology trends. And then from all this data, you try to form some insights or look for patterns. And then once you find anything interesting, that's essentially your conclusion. So this is a much slower method, but it has the advantage of not being as biased as the top-down approach. In reality, you do a bit of both. The bottom-up approach is much slower and is frankly impossible to collect every piece of data. And the top-down approach is quite susceptible to biases. So what's normally done is you start with the bottom-up approach. You basically gather information in areas which you think is relevant, and then you form a hypothesis, an initial hypothesis, and then you use the top-down approach to test these hypotheses and keep revising them till you arrive at a conclusion. So based on this, in a case, you can also structure in two different ways. But how do you know whether to use the bottom-up or the top-down approach? Well, it depends on the case question. And let's call it the what and the which questions. To solve what questions, use the bottom-up approach, and to solve the which questions, use the top-down approach. So, what are what questions? These are open-ended questions where they require you to find the reasons or the root cause of problems. So examples are, why did revenue drop, or why did profits drop? What should the company do to grow, or how should they sustain their competitive advantage? So here you can see they are very open-ended and you are supposed to try to find a solution. And then which questions are basically questions which gives you two options, A or B, or yes or no. And here using the top-down approach makes much more sense. So for example, should company X acquire company Y? Should a company open a new factory? So you can see here it's very much a multiple choice question. Is it yes or no? So let's start with what questions. The key here is to break it down into MISI components. And what we mean by MISI is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. What it means is you want each of your components to be not related to each other. So for example, revenue and costs are distinct. So they are mutually exclusive. And at the same time, you want it to be collectively exhaustive. In other words, each of the components added up should cover everything. So for example, revenue and costs is equal to profit. So it covers everything as far as profit is concerned. So it's exhaustive. So how do you produce MISI structures? We have three approaches here. The first is to use formulas or equations. So for example, profit is revenue minus costs. So that's a very good structure to use. Or revenue is equal to the revenue of all your products added together. Or revenue is price per unit times volume. So you can see these are essentially mathematical equations that you're using. And then the second approach is A, B, or other. Here's when you can't use an equation like how you did in the first approach. So for example, cost consists of raw material costs, labor costs, and then other costs. Why do we use other costs instead of trying to list everything? And the reason here is because costs, for example, might consist of 10 things, and in a case interview, you can't dig down into 10 things. So you pick 2 or 3 which you think are very important, and then use other to cover everything. And then the third approach is A or non-A. So for example, cost is the sum of variable costs and fixed costs. So variable costs and non-variable costs, in other words. Revenue is generated from domestic sales and international sales. So you can see this is 3 different approaches on how you can produce MISI structures. Now let's look at which questions. Here you need to determine the key decision criteria. So if you're deciding whether or not to enter a new market, ask yourself 3 questions. The first is, what is the purpose of making this decision? So, for example, we want to enter a new market because we want it to be profitable. We want positive return on investment. So that's the answer for the first question. And then, great. Second question, if we were to make a hypothesis that it is a good decision to enter this new market, what needs to be true? And in this case, we want a large growing market with low levels of competition. So that's your second criteria. And then your third question is, if I were to choose the other option, what needs to be true? So if I were to choose not to enter the market, what needs to be true? And in this case, perhaps the company is not capable of taking advantage of this trend. So you can see how, by answering these 3 questions, you're able to create 3 components within your structure. So let's illustrate this with an example. Some of you may have read our Telephone Inc. case example. It is free and available if you subscribe. But in this case, what we're trying to show is there is both the what and the which questions. In other words, you need both the bottom-up and the top-down approach to solve this case. So the first sections of the case involved the what structure. So what should Telephone Inc. do to increase its profit? And we use a formula approach. Profit is revenue minus cost. And then we broke this down further using formulas. And then later in the case, we asked the question of whether selling to MVNOs is an attractive option or not. And here, the answer is either yes or no. So you use the which structure. In other words, the top-down structure. So you answer the 3 questions: why you're making the decision, what needs to be true for this option to be attractive, and what would prevent you from selling to MVNOs. And based on these 3 answers to the 3 questions, you create 3 components within your structure. So some of you may be asking, why not just use standard frameworks? Many of us will have come across frameworks like profit is equal to revenue minus cost, or the 3 C's, or the business situation framework. Why don't just use this? Well, the advantage of this approach that we are discussing is that you're able to create custom structures in your interviews. And this is extremely important, especially recently, where case interviews are getting more and more complex. And the reason why case interviews are getting more and more complex is because candidates are basically getting better at solving them. So it is very common these days that you'll be given cases which are odd or require structures which you've not seen before. So standard frameworks will not really serve you well, and certainly won't help you in differentiating yourself from other candidates. But knowing how to create structures, it actually helps you tremendously in this kind of odd cases. So let's move on from structuring techniques. When you're actually trying to solve a case, how do you know when to ask for more information and when to synthesize information to form a useful conclusion. The best way is this diverge and converge structure. When you first are given a case to solve, you want to diverge. You basically want to gather as much information as possible. And as you do this, you reach a point where you have enough information to form a preliminary conclusion or a hypothesis. And then at this point, you want to converge, which is basically the opposite. You want to connect all these pieces together to form a useful answer. So you want to drop irrelevant information, you want to synthesize and create something smaller with all the information that you have. So normally you will be diverging and converging several times in a case. For example, you may be asked about how a company can gain more market share. You first diverge and gather some relevant information. And then once you discover some insights, you converge and conclude that, hey, there is a growing niche segment that the client is well placed to capture. But the case is not over yet. Now the next part of the case is you need to ask, okay, what is the best way to capture this niche market? You need to then diverge again to gather new information to answer this second question. And then converge to reach another conclusion on how to best capture this market. And this goes on several times until you reach the end of the case, where you have the final conclusion. So sometimes the interviewer will lead you through this process, but knowing this will really differentiate you from the rest, especially if the interviewer doesn't lead you much. Earlier we talked about 5 steps in the case interview and the 3 skills which are tested. So detailed thinking is often tested by giving you diagrams and asking you to analyze them. Quite often you'll be even asked to do some calculations. And one way to test high-level thinking, on the other hand, is by asking you to generate ideas or form recommendations. So how do you do well in these? Well, basically, good performance can be broken down into steps. And here are some suggestions on how you do these things well. So, if you're given a diagram or a table, the first thing you want to do is to study the diagram and then state what you observe. So literally say, okay, it seems that customers are getting more and more unhappy over the last 2 or 3 years based on this data. However, I see that the segment of, say, younger customers are actually getting happier. It's the older customers that are not so happy. So this is the second thing about identifying anything interesting. And then try to state some hypotheses. Think about how or why this might be the case. And then suggest what kind of analysis you can do. And by analysis, in a case interview context, it almost always means calculations. So you might say, okay, what I'll do is to take this number multiplied by that number to try to figure out something else. So these are 3 steps which would be very useful in coming across as very structured and very controlled in how you do your work. And then when you're actually doing the calculation, always explain to the interviewer what you intend to calculate before you actually calculate. So don't just jump into the calculation and then just produce the final answer. You want to explain to the interviewer why you're doing the calculation and how you're going to do it. And then while you're doing it, walk your interviewer through the whole process. Once you reach the final result, sense check. So say if you were calculating the revenue of a certain segment, and if you reach a number that's larger than the total revenue, you know that something is wrong, right? Or if you reach a number that's larger than, say, GDP, and you know that this company operates only in one country, that doesn't make sense either. So you need to then, that's why you need to really check your answer before you arrive at some kind of conclusion. And then state the implications of the result. Always link back the results of your calculation to that question which you initially asked. So if you're asked, should you recommend a client to enter a new market? What does this number tell you? Does this number support that move, or does this answer basically suggest that it's not a good idea? Always try to link it back. When generating ideas, always create 2 or 3 categories before listing out your ideas. So for example, if you are asked to think of how a company can increase their revenue, generate 3 or 4 categories first before listing out all the ways. So for example, you can say, we can think of distribution channels, customer segments, and pricing, for example. And then once you have done this, say, okay, for distribution, I can think of different channels, I can think of leveraging our current suppliers and distributors. And then within distribution, you can say, okay, some potential ways would be to incentivize our distributors to sell our products more, or to make our products more prominent on the shelves, or to get more distributors, or to look at different distribution channels. So you can see how by having several categories like this, you can generate a lot more ideas than just trying to generate ideas without the categories. So now we have covered the technical side of solving a case. Let's now look at the softer side of it. How do you come across as confident, as sure of what you're saying when you're solving a case? So here we'll go through some do's and don'ts to really differentiate you from the other candidates. So in a case interview, communication is vital. It is really a key part of the assessment. So watch these 3 things: your clarity, your confidence, and how you interact with the interviewer. In terms of clarity, always tell the interviewer your thinking process and your logic. Walk them through step by step so they can really follow your logic and your thinking. Don't just assume that the interviewer can read your mind. I mean, they can't. So make it very clear. State your thoughts. If you're thinking, hey, this seems like an odd piece of information, say that. As discussed previously, if you have multiple ideas, always categorize them in order to generate more ideas. Be concise. The interview is typically about half an hour, and that's not much time to solve a case. So say what's important and try to leave out irrelevant information. And then draw your structures clearly on a piece of paper and show it to the interviewer. So the paper and the pen is really a tool for you to use in a case interview. So use it well. Draw your structures clearly and write clearly, because it's not just for yourself, it's also for the interviewer to see and understand. And then confidence. Project yourself confidently and smart. You want to come across as open and friendly. And that's very important for consultants, because you will be interacting with colleagues a lot as well as a client, and you need to come across as someone who's sure of themselves and friendly. See your interviewer as a colleague who's working with you on this project. And that's essentially what a case interview is trying to simulate. So don't be too intimidated and see it as an assessment, although it is. See it more as really a work environment, just another meeting in your everyday work. And how you communicate with the interviewer should reflect that. And if you are unsure about anything, still state it with full confidence. And this is a very important thing which some people who's going from university to consulting sometimes struggle with. In consulting, a lot of things are ambiguous, and that's not something a person coming from a technical background like engineering is very used to. And for almost every conclusion or every statement, there's always a counter argument. State what you think is the case based on 80% of the evidence, and then at the end of it say, however, we need to be aware of 1, 2, or 3. 1, 2, and 3. This helps you state your position and your views, at the same time be open to potential criticisms, and then show your personality. It is important to sort of be yourself in a case interview. You don't want to come across as too rigid and someone with no personality. Just be relaxed. Showing your personality really means being relaxed and not taking yourself too seriously. But at the same time, it's very important to respect the interviewer. You don't want to come across as unprofessional or rude or arrogant. These are no-nos in consulting. And then interaction. Remember that an interview is really a conversation. It's not a monologue where you are just telling the interviewer everything. It is about discussing with the interviewer. So make it a conversation. If you want to involve the interviewer, a good way to do this is to suggest something and then ask if the interviewer agrees with it. So instead of asking the interviewer, what do you think I should do? Which is essentially asking the interviewer to solve the case for you, which is not a good idea. What you want to do is to say, okay, I suggest that we do this, that we analyze revenues first, for example. Do you agree with that? So you see how by doing that you have suggested something, so you have made an input. At the same time, you have involved the interviewer in the conversation. Keep an eye contact with your interviewer. When you're solving a case, sometimes you would be so involved with the case and so into the detail that you might be just staring at a piece of paper and writing stuff down. You don't want to do this. You want to look at the interviewer and make sure that he's really involved in a conversation. You don't speak to someone while looking at a piece of paper, right? And you don't want to do that in your interview. So make sure that you keep eye contact. And then another piece of advice is, when you've drawn anything or written anything down on a piece of paper, turn it around and show the interviewer so that it can be read easily. Some people find it difficult to read upside down, and doing this makes it a lot easier for the interviewer, and it also comes across as open and interactive. So it's definitely something to do. It is great to know what to do in a case interview, but it's also equally important to know what not to do. So we'll talk about two different things here in terms of actually solving the case and in terms of communication. These are things you don't want to do. So do not skip steps in your logic or your calculations. So what we mean here is literally say or explain every step within your logic and your calculations. Don't assume that the interviewer knows what you're doing. Do not make calculation errors. Well, easier said than done, but remember that in consulting, you want to be 100% correct. You can't make any errors. At university and in school, getting 90% or so correct is considered very good, but in consulting, you want to be 100% correct. So how do you make sure that you do not make any calculation errors? Well, practice. Do not start talking before thinking clearly. This is something which helps you be more concise. If you think before you speak, you will be able to say sentences which are shorter and clearer. Do not make things up that you are unsure about. And this is very important, especially if the interviewer uses terms which you do not understand. Do not be afraid to ask questions which you may think is silly. Like, what is MVNO in our case example that we gave earlier? Make sure you ask these things if you are unsure about it. Do not try to fit the case into a preset framework. And this is the reason why we talked about how you actually build a structure rather than using a framework. Do not jump to conclusion too quickly without adequate justification. Always make sure you can back your conclusions or your suggestions. Don't just say, well, I think this might be the case and I don't really know why. Always make sure you can back it up very, very strongly, especially if the interviewer starts questioning you. Communication. Do not make the interview a monologue. As we mentioned earlier, it is a conversation, it is a discussion, and you don't want to be the only one talking. Do not ask questions that make the interviewer solve the case. So don't ask, how do I do this? Or what do you think we should do? Always make some suggestion before asking these kinds of questions. Do not lose your confidence when challenged, but accept your interviewer's valid points. And the interviewer will challenge you sometimes, and what you need to do is to be very fact-based and try to defend your position using your backing and the evidence that you use to even arrive at that conclusion. But also accept their valid points, because as we said, there's always counter-arguments. And do not defend yourself too much, especially if you're wrong. This happens occasionally, and when it does, just accept it and carry on. It's not necessarily that bad. So at the very beginning, we said that to master solving cases, you need both knowledge and practice. Now that you have knowledge of many important topics, it is important that you practice these things. You want to have muscle memory so that you're basically doing these things as second nature. You want to be able to solve a case interview even in a high tension environment, like a case interview. To do all the things that we discuss, you definitely need to practice and to internalize them. You want to be able to do these things without having to consciously remind yourself during the case. This will help you free up your mind to actually think about the case itself. This is a chart here which illustrates what we are trying to say about practicing. Imagine if you and your friend decide to learn how to play tennis, and you've never played it before. And you decide to hire a coach to teach you, while your friend decided to just hit the courts and start trying to play. So you can imagine what happens. Your friend would spend the first day actually hitting balls already. He would try to swing the racket, try to hit the balls. His first or second ball might go completely off the court, and then he starts to get a hang of it and starts hitting okay shots. You, on the other hand, would have spent probably a whole day learning how to hold a racket, how to move around the court, and some rules about the game. So now after a month, if the two of you decide to play a game, chances are your friend would win because he has spent the whole month actually playing tennis, actually hitting the ball, actually running around the court, actually understanding the game. Whereas you had just spent the whole month learning how to hold the racket and move around the court. But then what happens after a while, maybe the third month or so, depending on how much you practice, you will start to overtake your friend because you are actually doing things the correct way. You actually know how to hold the racket and swing correctly and move around the court very quickly. So if you decide to play again after, say, the 4th or 5th month, you find that you'll be way better than your friend because your friend's basically using all the wrong techniques. And it'll be very difficult for your friend to catch up with you after that because you're basically on a steeper learning curve right now, while he has to unlearn everything that he did before he can start again to try to catch up. So how does this apply to practicing case interviews? Basically, you want to know how to do things correctly. And it is worth investing some time at the beginning to really understand what is right and what is wrong, to really try to understand all the different techniques that you can use and apply them. It's always about knowing and then applying. As we said, knowledge and then practice. Don't just jump in and then try to practice without really gaining the best knowledge. And here is where it is very helpful to have someone who actually knows how to do case interview helping you. So for example, if you know someone who's already got a job offer or someone who's already working in consulting who went through this process not too long ago, try to ask them to help you. See if you can get them to give you 1 or 2 cases, because these are the people who did it and succeeded. They know how to do it and they can give you a big head start. Another thing to be aware is there are typically 4 stages in your case interview practice journey. So the first stage is where you don't really know anything about cases. You just heard that consulting firms would give you a case interview, and that's about all you know. What you need to do here is basically get your head around what a case interview is in terms of its structure, its process, all the concepts involved in a case. You need to really just know what it's about. And then once you really understand it, stage 2 is where you need to solve a few cases yourself. You need to start coming up with your own approach. You need to discover your style. And one reason why we describe how to actually create structures versus using fixed frameworks is so that you're able to find your own style and approach. And this is very important, especially these days where cases are much more complex. You need to be able to adapt and react very quickly when you're given a case which you're not used to. And having your own style really helps here. And then you move on to the third stage. Remember how we talked about diverging and converging? Stages 1 and 2 are diverging, where you're learning and discovering. At stage 3, you are converging. You need to start working on your weaknesses and strengthening your strengths here. Basically, you are taking all the things which you already know and discovered and improving on them. So you want to get better at structuring, better at calculations, better at communication. And then finally you reach stage 4, where it's all about consistency. You see, it is not very hard to do well when conditions are right. But how do you do well when you are stressed out, or if the case is a little strange, or if the interview didn't really start very well? Consistency is key if you want a job from a top firm. You see, one of the things that differentiates the best sports players in the world from just good players is consistency. The number 1 player doesn't score twice the amount as player number 20. Whether it's in tennis or football or swimming or anything, the number 1 player is probably only about 1% better than the person in the 20th position. But the key differentiator here is consistency. And it's the same thing in consulting firms, especially at top firms in the final rounds. If you are within the top 20 of 4,000 applicants, the thing that really differentiates you will be consistency at this point. Can you do all 4 or 5 of your interviews very well, or will you falter in 1 or 2 of them? This will be what determines whether or not you get the job. Finally, one of the things that is really enjoyable about cases is that it simulates consulting work to a certain degree. If you enjoy cases, you're very likely to enjoy the career. So it's a very good way to assess whether or not this job is right for you. If you have any questions, do write us an email at md@consultingapplications.com. We aim to answer every question if possible. And best of luck in your journey.